just wanted to thank everybody again for coming, and all my students. I love you all. You all get A's in every class you took this semester. I'll make sure. But I just wanted to say that as I was talking outside, I think it was Suzanne, and she pointed out who's paying for all this, and I thought, well, I thought I made it clear before, but I want to make it clear again, because I do want to say how much of this is a community effort and collaborative, because we are receiving funds from Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, I have to say that first. The Office of the President, from Musselman Library Special Collections, from alumni and family and parent relations, but they're two separate things, and don't confuse them. And also, I hope I'm not forgetting, and the Women's Center has provided a lot of support, even if not a lot of financial, but everything counts. We need moral support too, and I'm very happy that you're all here, and our panel at this point is focusing on faculty experiences, which is a kind of way of saying we're now moving beyond the 70s, at least in the sense of everybody who's up here now came after the 70s. Everybody here came either in the 80s, the 90s, or even in the millennium. It's an interesting turn now, and This Is the Way We Are Now is the title of this panel. And to explain how far we've come, I just thought I would read something, because it reminded me of something Nancy said about language and Mary Margaret said about language, and how they had to work very hard on the language in the 70s. And this is an original draft, an original copy. It's a mimeograph copy. It's an original mimeograph. And I don't know if all of you remember mimeographs, but those of us who were here alive in the 70s remember mimeograph. It always had a kind of funny smell, and you might even get on your fingers at the time to dry. But this is a response of a faculty member who shall remain anonymous, although Nancy has a suspicion who it may have been. Written in response to that whole effort to change language. And I'll just read the first paragraph. It says, "To all factual persons, from Gettysburg Office of Nonsense and Dribble, Gonad." It says, "We would hope that members of the Gettysburg College community have noticed the new style that has begun to characterize the official communications issued by college agencies. We would have you understand that this new style is part of a calculated effort to effectively implement the college's new policy of eliminating all traces of sexism in every kind of interpersonal relationship and communication. Presently, as you have hopefully noted, we have implemented the usage of the term chairperson. We have considered this first move carefully and decided on it as an important first step. However, now that we have taken this first step for person kind, we would inform you that we would take our next step more rapidly. It is our wish that you be informed of our desire to efficiently alter the sexist nature." And then he has other, at least Nancy thinks it's a true. Person kind, person whole, person slaughter, person animal, person eater, person hour. So I just think it's important to see. And this is real. As you can see, I don't have a mimeograph in my machine. Okay. I could not think of a better way to introduce our faculty panel than to read from an email sent by Katie Marchetti, class of 2007, who appeared inside. Our first alum to go on for a PhD in women's studies. This, to me, seemed the best way to explain where we are now. And this is, it's on the table over there. At Gettysburg, every women's studies class mirrored the academic rigor and student-faculty engagement I have experienced in the PhD program at Penn State. Leading class discussions, completing critical reflections papers, becoming involved in local women's organizations, and engaging in peer review and collaborative work with student colleagues and faculty members were all valuable experience offered to me, offered by the Women's Studies Department at Gettysburg College. As I prepare for my comprehensive exam in Women's Studies made this coming May, I know that the training I received as a Women's Studies major at Gettysburg serves as a strong foundation for the work and research I'm doing as a graduate student. So I thought that was just really so nice. She couldn't be here, so she sent me this email to let us know how she felt about her experience as a woman here at Gettysburg College. And actually, she's giving a paper And now that I've introduced the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, it is time to introduce our panel. I should begin by saying that Professor Deborah Barnes was unable to make it today, and those of you who know her know that she's not here. As you can see, it took two people to take her place, and we are grateful that Sandy and Lydia both agreed to fill in at the last minute. Our first speaker is Charlotte Armster, professor of German, and also doing as Janet did in the morning and having people speak in the year they arrived, and then within the year that they arrived in alphabetical order. I think that makes, it gives us a sense of the continuity of the history. So our first speaker is Charlotte Armster, professor of German and founding mother of women's studies. She has taught many courses in women, gender, and sexuality studies, but perhaps her most challenging is women and Nazism. Our second speaker, Sandy Gill, professor of sociology, is also a founding mother. It takes a lot of mothers to found a mother. Is also a founding mother. Her gender inequalities course continues to intrigue our students. Elizabeth Richardson Reedy, professor of French and associate provost for faculty development, also a founding mother, has not only taught famous French femme fatales, probably our most alliterative course, but has recently created a first-year seminar devoted to women's experience over the past 100 years. Lydia Wasson and Casey Hopkins came to Gettysburg in 2002 and has become an active member of our program, teaching such vital courses as Italian women writers and feminism and pornography. The newest addition to Gettysburg College into our Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program is Brett Rogers, who came to Gettysburg in 2008. His course, Queer Eye on America, has quickly become a popular staple of the program. The question these 5 people will answer in 6 minutes, or less. 8? 6 to 8. Is, how did the 70s, the women's movement, and feminism affect your life of scholarship and teaching?
Hi, everybody. Over lunch, I was talking to Sandy Gill, who's going to be talking in a few moments too, and then before that, with Elizabeth, and the 3 of us, we're not a circle of 3. We did this individually. We said, how can we follow those women in the beginning? They were so great. What can we say? So let me thank the first panel very, very much. You are brilliant, you are inspiring, and you are really leaders for us. Whoops, sorry about that. Tema asked me, or asked all of us, how did the women's movements, the 70s, and feminism affect your life, your scholarship, and your teaching? And I thought, oh my God, where am I going to begin? It affected it all over. But before I say what I wrote down a few notes, I know we've thanked a lot of people, and there are a lot of people to thank here for the organization. There's Joyce, there are all sorts of other people. But I really feel that the main speaker here today was Tema Berg. And it was her creative idea, her drive, her push, her vision that allowed this to come together. So I'd like to give her a hand. Not in my notes at this point, it's at a later point, but women's studies, women's movements, feminism is really about, for me, friendship. And that's why I picked that up from Tema, because we've been friends. I came 84, she came 85. We have been friends ever since. We finished each other's sentences. We thought we were married for a while. And then we hated each other because we co-coordinated women's studies for 6 years together. And there were times we fought, and so I guess we were married. We're still sort of married, right? Okay. All right. When I said this to you about how did women's movement and feminism in the 70s affect my life, scholarship, and teaching, the first thing I thought, well, how the hell has it not affected everything? And it has affected me, I think, since I was a Bronxite girl. I was born and raised in the Bronx. And then I lived for many years in Istanbul. And so I think I've always been affected by it, but I didn't know it necessarily. I knew in my gut it was wrong. And I think it was one of the speakers before earlier, maybe it was Jane, or it might have been you, Susan, I can't remember who said, I think it was Jane, who said when she came here, it was being called a co-ed. It didn't sit right. It was in her gut. And I think we've had a lot of things in our guts that we now are able to formulate, to put into a more articulate way and express ourselves and have a voice. And I think that's the most important thing. So personal choices, professional interests, teaching style, goals, everything. And I was going to start off by saying jeans and condoms. And you think, jeans and condoms, what does that have to do with it? Well, I was talking to a colleague yesterday and we said, what are we going to wear tomorrow? You know? And I said, jeans. And she said, good, I will too. So that we are able to wear jeans and not slacks. And you know, when I went to school, it was slacks, and you could only wear them if it was 20 degrees or below at college. And of course, you didn't wear them at home. You might have worn dungarees that were lined in the winter. Okay, you're smiling, Cody, you know, right? You know. So I was thinking jeans. Now that may not seem like, oh, what are you talking about? That's so insignificant, so anti-intellectual, but it isn't really. Well, some of the things we talked about in the 60s and the 70s was, what do we wear? What do we do? How do we behave? I remember my first real job, real job, permanent job, was at Dartmouth College, and I was one of 7 women out of 250 men, and they had just gone co-ed. That meant the 7 of us had to band together, and we quickly did. And coming back to jeans, one of the things we talked about is, what do we wear? We had to wear suits. It had to announce to the public that we were professionals. And so now that I can wear jeans, you can see them, that may not be significant to you, but it is to me. I don't have to wear this suit anymore. You know, not just because I'm old and don't care. There's that too. You get older and you don't pay. What the heck, you know, you wear what you want. But now the other thing was condoms. What? You know, that's not something I wear. Right? You realize I've never worn one, although there are female condoms. But why I raised that is that when I came to Gettysburg College, of course there was no women's studies program, and there were very few courses, or almost none. They were very sporadic, as Mary Margaret has pointed out, about women. But more importantly, the health center did not address issues of sexuality. And one of the things they did not do was have, God forbid, a condom in sight, or any kind of birth control. And if you go to the health center now, you can walk in there and there's a dish, a bowl, and it's got condoms in it. Now that may seem like maybe vulgar to you. I don't think it's vulgar. It allows our students and us to talk about issues that concern us and concern our students and concern everybody else. It allows our students to have a sexuality that is theirs. And a lot of this has come through the 70s, through the women's movement, and certainly through feminism. So there you see my jeans and my condoms theme here. I wanted to tell you that in the early 70s, it really allowed me to move away, in the early 70s, before I came here, it allowed me to move away from a male-centered world. I didn't say it allowed me to move away from men. I have a son, I have a husband, I have a brother, I have male friends. But a male-centered world where the world was male and everything related to. And we talk about that in women's studies as women being the other. And then we expanded and we understood in women's studies that it wasn't just women who were the other, it's a lot of marginalized people. And when you think about it, transgendered, racial, and class, things I mentioned before. And so that has allowed women's studies really, or maybe forced women's studies, I'm not sure which way, to examine issues that are very, very touchy, very difficult, and very personal. And it did that for me. It made me have decisions in my love relationships, in my sexuality, about my body, about who I am, and what I was wearing or what I was not wearing. They were immediate and personal issues. And in the 70s, I think somebody, maybe Susan, mentioned consciousness raising. Well, there was something called consciousness raising groups. And they were small groups in little rooms. And there were maybe 8 women, no more. Men were never a part of this. We locked them out. We really did. We locked them out. We said, you can't come. And they said, we want to come. No, we can't come. This is for women. And they didn't understand it. And we didn't even understand it, but we didn't care. We were in consciousness raising groups and we talked about everything. We talked about big issues, we talked about small issues, we talked about personal issues, and it was from these consciousness raising groups in the late 60s into the 70s that we really, that something called women's studies as an academically accepted intellectual endeavor came. And I just want to bring that home again. We did have rules in these consciousness raising groups. They were, the major rules were we don't hurt each other and we don't spread what we talk about here stays here. And that's not a Las Vegas thing. We talked a lot about being able to work. And you mentioned the 60 cents to the dollar. That was one issue, of course that was one issue, but just being able to work, to be recognized. When I first started teaching, I would have male students come into my office and put their feet on my desk as they talked to me. So was I able to work? No, not. I had to deal with that first. I had male colleagues, and this was at Dartmouth College, which had gone from a completely male school to now a co-ed school, who never ever said hello to me, no matter that I was on 15 committees, important committees. So definitely that was very, very important. We talked about our sexuality, as I said before. We talked about having babies and how we were going to do that. We didn't have maternity leave. Not at all. It was not a concept. So we had to make it a concept, and some of us did. And I'm very proud to say that I was in that first group, but of course, in being in that first group, you also get bruised a lot. So, maternity leave. And when I came to Gettysburg College, somebody is sitting in the audience with a smile on her face, because when she became pregnant, I said, you gotta ask for maternity leave. And she said, but no, and the rest of the conversation is not germane, but maternity leave was not yet an entitlement, a privilege, or it was something, why do you need that? Then quit working. So that was one of the things, one major thing we were talking about, because women do have babies, and they have a limited time to do this. I can't do it anymore. Yes, I would want to. I would like more kids if I could have them. We also talked about not having babies, which is equally important to having babies. That may sound strange to you, but not having babies is also a choice. It's a biological choice, perhaps, or not even having babies you adopt, that it is not necessarily that you are only a mother or a mothering figure. And that today still is an issue, I say. Maybe it isn't, I don't know. We talked, of course, about women's writings, and Mary Margaret Stewart mentioned that, autobiographical writings, which were not considered, what was a woman's autobiography? It was nothing. Or we didn't even know they were written. We discovered texts. We discovered women writers who were shunted off or who were not published. We had to dig them out, literally dig them out. We also talked about the daily things in women's lives, being in the kitchen. And I'm teaching a class on women in the film, and we were just talking about a film called Shirley Valentine, which I highly recommend to you. It's very amusing and very enlightening. It's an English film. Remember, Shirley Valentine. And in there, they talk about all sorts of things like what I've just said, including women's writings, discovering women. We talked about co-teaching, and some of us co-taught. And I can tell you, and I think you're going to find this rather strange because it's not long ago, I was co-teaching with a wonderful colleague of mine, a male. And I discovered when we walked in, I said, well, let's redo the room. And he, what? Let's do the room. What are you talking about? And I said, in a circle. And he said, oh, okay. And then we started the class, and he was a little earlier than I was, and I found him in the class with a huge table spread out with a lot of things, and that's where he sat. It was a podium. And so I thought, what the hell was that? I'm just gonna sit with the students. And I went and sat with them, and what I discovered was really painful. By sitting with the students, I was diminished. The students didn't look at me, didn't listen. They were looking at the podium guy. So unfortunately, I talked and I said, let's do a circle. And yeah, let's do it. We never did it. 2 weeks into the course, I thought, forget this. I sat on the podium and I spread my stuff out. Eventually, I got a couple of times that we actually did a circle, which was very, very nice. And I'm not sure if my colleague really ever learned what I was trying to do. And what I was trying to do was a pedagogy that we had developed and talked about a lot in women's studies. And that had come out of a lot of the talk from the 60s and the 70s, and giving students, male and female, a voice, which is also part of feminism. It's giving everybody a voice, not just the women, not just this group, but everybody a voice. And I so believe that. It's so part of my life. And that has to do with what I call collaborative teaching and collaborative learning. Yeah, they go together for us. It's a holistic concept. It includes how I raise my children. It includes my relationships. It includes my scholarship, certainly. It includes my intellectual interests, and it includes how I act in the kitchen, frankly. I cook, don't worry. I cook. We were raising questions about women's representation in literature, but also in film and in daily advertising. And when I teach my course, Women in Film, the first thing I do is talk about advertising on film and how many pictures we see of women in film. And when I talk about that, then I open up, what about class? What about race? What about sexuality? All the time. And these things all come from our discussions in the 60s and 70s. And now I would like to say the 60s and the 70s, we women from the 60s and 70s stand on the shoulders of those who worked very hard in the 20s and 30s, and those who worked harder in 1890 and 1880 and 1860 and before that. Some organized, some less organized, but we all stand on each other's shoulders. And that's to me also feminism and what this all means. So, for me, feminism in women's studies cuts across class, race lines. It has made my personal world and my professional world one. It's united. Thank you.
I'm Sandy Gill, and I think I've taken a slightly different read on this than Charlotte has, but please forgive me because I am Deb Barnes' replacement, so I didn't have as much time to prepare. But being Deb Barnes' replacement, which no two people can be Deb Barnes' replacement, but I will begin with the issue. I was asked to talk about how did the 70s, the women and the women's movement affect my life, scholarship, and teaching. And I have to go back to the 60s because I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I grew up a few blocks from all the photos that you've seen of the dogs and the hoses. I grew up where the civil rights movement was really making headway. And so that is really the basis that I think about. And I think all of us in the women's movement need to recognize the amazing courage that was shown by the people in the civil rights movement. And from that point, to see the courage that they showed, that they were able to portray, and to, in a sense, see the transformation from being second-class citizens, not that I'm saying, but that transformation from the level of oppression and subjugation, to see that and to see how the world could change really, really influenced my life, and I think is the basis from which my interest in everything that's on the cutting edge and everything that's changing, that's the basis of where that came from. So I'm going to talk a lot more about personal reflections. The beginning of the 70s found me as the first white teacher in an all-black elementary school, which was amazing to see a completely different world. I thought I knew you know, I'd seen black people, but I really got to experience what it was like to be black by becoming close to some elementary school children and learning from their experience. Then while I was doing this, and maybe I shouldn't admit it, but all the peace movement and student movement was going on in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And so I called in sick a few days from elementary school to go off to the University of Alabama, where there was so much challenging of, and it was the peace movement. It was also challenging the distinctions that had always been made between men and women. And so this being there to watch what was going on the University of Alabama campus when the Highway Patrol, the Alabama State Troopers who had been trained to beat up black people, turned their clubs on white kids on campus. So it was a really, really eye-opening experience. So partially because of that, I ended up in graduate school at the University of Alabama the next year because that was where everything was going on. So I was in graduate school for a couple of years, and some women started to organize a NOW chapter in Tuscaloosa, and they brought Gloria Steinem in to speak. So my best friend and I said, oh, well, let's go. Let's just see what's going on. So we went, found it interesting, and then there were her boyfriend and my boyfriend. We met them afterwards at my boyfriend's apartment, and we were just, you know, chatting. And my boyfriend interrupted me as he typically did. I mean, I didn't even notice it. And my friend says, excuse me, but I was listening to what Sandy was saying. Oh my God. It was like the man just, and from then on, I don't think my boyfriend ever interrupted me in public. So I said, yes, sign me up for that. If one presentation from Gloria Steinem did this, imagine what being a member. So from the University of Alabama, I went on to teaching in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And when I was there was a much more organized or established NOW chapter. And they asked me, because I was a professor, I assume, to help to facilitate a consciousness raising group. So that was one of the most amazing experiences, because it was a diverse group. There were 8 women, there were 2 black women, there were a couple women that didn't have college degrees, there were several professional women. But as we talked and talked more, we found out that in our group were 2 women who had been raped. In our group was a woman who had been labeled a slut when she was in high school. And she talked about her experiences and how that had affected her. And then I guess the real point where we really gelled as a group was when one of the women came out as a lesbian and talked about her experiences of being a lesbian. So it was really eye-opening for me to begin to see the different experiences that women had. And consciousness raising groups tended not to last a long time because you got to the point where you understood the dilemmas that everybody was facing, and then you wanted to turn your attention to actually doing something about it. So our group became a rape crisis, started a rape crisis center because of the 2 women who had been raped in the group, and were able to organize a rape crisis center, the first rape crisis center in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. But then I was ready to go on to graduate school because I was teaching with an MA at that time. And one of the things about having my master's from the University of Alabama is that it was an all-male department, and I really had no mentor. And I think that some of the women can relate to this, because if you wanted a mentor, and I think this was true at Alabama and Oregon, there was one way you could get a mentor, and I wasn't interested. So I actually at times wore combat boots to classes because I felt it would symbolically show my strength, and maybe I would have to use them, you know. So when I went to graduate school, I knew I wanted to go somewhere where women were taken seriously as students. Because even though I made A's, I happened to be interviewing for a job, the job in Winston-Salem at Wake Forest, and someone left my file sitting on the desk when he left, and on top was one of my letters of recommendation, which said that 2 sentences, one saying first what the person had taught me, that Sandy is a nice person and has a good reputation in the community. And that was my letter of recommendation for an academic job. So I really wanted to be somewhere where I was going to be taken seriously. So I went through the American Sociological Association Guide to Graduate Programs and counted how many women there were. And I applied sight unseen to universities just based on knowing that they had women on their sociology faculty and that they had tenured women on their sociology faculty. So I was incredibly lucky through this haphazard method of selection. Needless to say, I didn't apply to any Ivy League places. Through this haphazard method, I managed to end up in the program in the United States that was really on the cutting edge of doing sociology of women and working with some of the most amazing scholars and being taken very seriously as a graduate student. So I will not take any more of your time, but just to encourage us, just one more thing about my scholarship. Now my scholarship, originally I was doing almost everything on gender. Now I'm taking my scholarship back to the civil rights movement and looking at white's collective memory of the civil rights movement, because I really feel that this is one of the areas that I can make a contribution in.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Richardson Beatty, and I have to say that there were moments this morning when I could have wept. I remember Grace Kenny. The alums were so eloquent. It was a very moving moment this morning. I have to say that, also it wasn't all tears actually. Your memories reminded me of some of my memories as an undergraduate, and I actually went to Wake Forest. Charlotte and Sandy and I had some connections for different reasons. But I remember as an undergraduate at Wake Forest, our transgressions were not limited to, but often involved sneaking alcohol into the dormitories, because North Carolina is a dry state. Women weren't supposed to be drinking. The men, of course, could have all the alcohol they wanted. And we had a sign that would move from room to room. It was named the Hungry Lips Cafe. And we would sneak alcohol. It was for Friday and Saturday nights if you didn't have a date, because we dated in those days. And we would fix our slow gin fizzes and lip sync to the Supremes. I must tell you that Gettysburg College actually focused my feminism. I am the only child of a man who thought, although he wouldn't have labeled himself a feminist, he thought I could do anything. I could go anywhere and I could do anything. So it never crossed my mind that I couldn't. So I didn't necessarily notice, or was I preoccupied with the gender differences that I saw at Wake Forest. I began to notice the differences that were associated with civil rights movements. So first, of course, with African Americans, because my first husband was African American. And still is, I guess. I always say that. I assume he still is. I haven't seen him in a very long time. But I noticed that I was treated very differently when, in the 70s, I was out in public with him. So that did give me pause. It was food for thought. And then when I moved on to graduate school in the 70s at New York University, I was living in the West Village, which, as you know, is a gay community. And so I was very involved with my gay and lesbian friends in marches for gay and lesbian rights. So it's not surprising that my feminism should be associated with the civil rights movement, because indeed feminism did grow out of that movement, as well as the anti-war movement. But it wasn't until I should actually say something about NYU. I'm a professor of French, and the French do hierarchy extremely well. And the department was heavily male, and I was speaking to one of my professors one day, and he was really questioning my sexuality because I wasn't sleeping with any of the professors. So that too began to provoke some thought along the lines of feminism. But as I said, it was when I came to Gettysburg College that, fortunately for me, my feminism was focused. Sandy and Charlotte and I all came in 1984, and I think it was perhaps the first largest cohort of women. It didn't dawn on me that there hadn't been many women before us. Just as when I went to Wake Forest, it hadn't dawned on me that it had only been integrated the year before. I had grown up in the North, and so I was accustomed to integration. So when I came here, it didn't dawn on me that there hadn't been many women before. Mary Margaret Stewart, I have to refer to her because she was a prominent woman on campus and certainly a role model for me. But fortunately, because I was part of this large female cohort, we began the Women's Studies program. We had the Commission on Women. I think it was the first or second year I was here. And I realized the commission was necessary to look into the disparities between the salaries that men and women were earning here at the college. So all of a sudden, issues that were latent in my mind became latent in my mind, if you will. And we had, in this very room, a discussion about the Women's Studies program. Should it be approved? And I recall Chan Coulter, perhaps some of you remember him, professor of philosophy, speaking about women in such a way that provoked me to stand up and remind him that we were not a 20th century phenomenon, that we've actually been around for quite some time. I also had the opportunity, my second year, to participate in the NEH Summer Seminar on feminist literary theory, and that brought me to feminism in my research. I'm a member of Women in French. All of the research that I do is based on feminist theory or on women writers. And so, again, this is something that occurred while I was here at Gettysburg College. I want to say that we've seen many changes with women faculty, and of course we have our second female president. We're delighted, as you all know, delighted to have Janet Morgan as our president. I am delighted also by my young women faculty, such as Lydia, and also young male faculty as well. I actually was part of the group that interviewed Brett for this position. He was our first choice, and we're delighted that he is here and part of our program. So it's interesting to see, for example, at faculty meetings, and I see some other young colleagues here as well. When I first arrived, and I think Charlotte and Sandy will back me up on this, we as women didn't speak up as frequently as we should have. But the young women today do. And it is a joy to see. And I want to also end by saying that our young women's students, and our young men as well, I see Deontay, who is my first seminar, but I always end the year when we have our party, our Women's Gender and Sexuality party for our graduating Women's Studies students. I always say to them, we are not afraid of the future. because we see so many wonderful young men and women. And this is just one institution. I was saying this earlier. One institution, so we have every reason to be optimistic about the future.
Hello. So my take is actually going to be a little different insofar as I'm actually going to talk about my experience with my family, because I was adopted and my father is a very traditional Italian man who's just turned 80, so he's also a little older, and my mother's a very, very English woman. And I think when you combine sort of very Italian and very English, you come with a very, very traditional family. And I remember when I was probably about, I think I might have been after college, I was having a conversation with my father. My younger sister was there too, she's only 2 years younger than me. And he said, there are 2 words that I absolutely hate, that are the worst words you could think of. One of the words was communism, and the other word was feminism. And so I actually, most of my sort of younger, especially even during college life, I was not really aware of what the 70s and the women's movement brought to me, or what chances it would offer me. My parents did obviously support that I had an education and a profession. My younger sister is a doctor. But when it came to the actual role in society that women were supposed to have, there was very much a sense of appropriate gender roles, and there was no sort of crossing these roles. And just to give you an example, just this past summer, and I'm 38 now, and my husband and I were visiting my parents, and he does his laundry, he does his ironing, I do my laundry, and sometimes I do my ironing. So his shirt was very wrinkly, and so my mother, when he wasn't there, pulls me aside and she says, I would never let my husband leave the house looking like that. So it's, I was also very shy and not a very secure person in my sense of self, and so I actually had the opportunity to go to Barnard College as an undergraduate, and perhaps because I was in the city, perhaps because it was a women's college in a larger university, I didn't take advantage of the fact of that, this was a place where I could explore feminist theory, I could explore these topics that were eventually going to be very dear to me. And I remember one time I took a literature class, and it was a visiting professor, and it was a French class, and we studied female authors, and at the end of the class she said, well, how many of you, and it was probably mostly women, would consider yourselves a feminist? And this was after we'd spent the whole semester studying women, female authors, social issues, and including myself, barely anybody dared to raise their hand. There was still that sort of fear, and I think it's not a fear that would come from perhaps the same background of maybe one that was still living or was in the early process of benefiting from the 70s movement, but it was one that actually was a fear of a sort of a post-feminist approach. It was so, well, the 70s happened, it was these raging lesbians with hairy armpits, and we're not going to associate ourselves with them, so we're now this post-feminist group, and we like to wear our short skirts and our makeup, and we're not going to associate with them, and so that's an equally scary word. And so I'm actually, I regret in a way to not have followed a different path in college, but so I went to NYU as well for my grad school, and that's where, primarily through literary criticism, that I discovered feminism and feminist theory, and it informed my scholarship all the way in different ways, but and so it was, while it initially took place in the form of literary criticism, so we would, so part of my interest, for example, looked at ways to go beyond. So if we look sort of in a very sort of brief history, there was an initial sort sort of denouncing male authors for depictions of femininity, and then there was a reevaluating female authors, and I wanted to do a slightly different approach, was return to male authors and actually find within these sort of stereotypical figures sort of feminist heroines that you could take away or sort of steal or do what's been termed as a conceptual theft, so take away from the gospel of the author and give these characters new meanings. And so I found this to be very exciting, but it also then inspired me to, as I read all of the theory that helped me affect these analyses, inspired me to also look at questions of gender and systems of inequality. And so that's where I then now have these very vocal debates with my father. They don't always end very well. But, and interestingly enough, my mother, who made this famous comment, her mother was actually a doctor. So she had the possibility of looking at women's paths differently, but I think because she decided not to go the path of choosing career, she perhaps returned much more sort of significantly into her traditional role as mother and housewife, and it wasn't just sort of thinking of my father who thinks of this concept as being really terrible, but it was also just looking at the dynamic that went on in the house. And so my father would come home from work and he would not lift a finger to get the dinner ready or to help clean up afterwards. He would come and sit down when it was ready, and he'd leave to watch TV. When the meal was over, and my mother and us three girls did everything else, and he would. I remember one time he got really upset with my mother because he paired the two wrong socks because they were different colors accidentally, and so all this sort of sense, and I thought I can't really accept to grow up in this stuff, and so. With my experience and through my interest in literature, I did develop the tools and the interest to provide a different path for myself. And so that to me is what the 70s and the feminist movement was. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Brett Rogers. I'm an assistant professor in both classics and women, gender, and sexuality studies. Before I say anything further, I should say it's really humbling to be up here. First, after that first panel, which I found really moving in a lot of ways, and to think about what it was like to be a woman here in the 60s and 70s, and then hearing what we heard over lunch and trying to think about the history of the institution. And I study ancient education, so I'm always really interested in how institutions do things. And also humbled to be up here with my colleagues who have been fighting the good fight for a really long time and doing a really excellent job. As you might be able to tell, and I think Elizabeth already outed me, I'm a male, a biological male, and I at least last time I checked. Don't let the beard or the suit fool you. Of course, it's an act of drag. But the thing that makes me really feel very humbled is not just that I'm a male who's up here, but also my age, because the youngest members of our first panel, graduate Vanessa and Janet, sort of in the first panel, and I can't remember, was it Jane also graduated in 77. So that was the year I was born. Thank you, good night, good night. Well, I'm not asking your age. And that's actually really important to why I'm standing here right now. And part of it, since I study the classics, I'm very deeply embedded in history and canon. And I want to use a three-part model as a way to explain why that's really important. And to sort of follow Charlotte's cue, film, and the fact that I do classics, I'm going to use Star Wars. Because I was born 2 months before Star Wars came out, which came out right around the time that the class of 77 was graduating. So I never got to see that movie in the theater with you. The first movie we probably saw in the theater together was The Empire Strikes Back, which is sadly a really appropriate metaphor. And I'll explain that. But I just want to point out, so it's 77, there are rebels destroying giant spaceships. There's a feeling of liberation. Of course, special effects have changed the way that the human imagination is able to conceive of what we can at least put on film. Everybody's really excited. The marketing hasn't impressed everybody yet, although that's about to happen. And I think there's this moment of excitement that I I feel like I lived on the I just barely missed something really exciting. And actually my whole life has sort of felt like that, because my last year of high school was the last, I was writing all my applications on typewriters. And then my first year of college was the first year I had email, using my Mac Plus 1986 computer to be able to write things. And so I literally straddle the difference between old technologies and new technologies and so forth. And I think that's actually really important. Now, I like to think of the 80s as like The Empire Strikes Back, which came out in 1980, because things started to shift. We have Reagan-era politics, we have Thatcherism, we have economic crises, we have war. What constitutes a war starts to get a little hazy in how we do things. And so there's all this stuff in which systems are starting to assert themselves. In fact, I might say George Lucas, by the way, he never took pay for Star Wars to direct it, he took merchandise rights. And that explains why a lot of marketing to kids looks the way it does now, because George Lucas was the pioneer to getting children to want to make everybody's parents buy things for them in a really, really insidious way, right? If you want to change the world, you go for the children. So now, meanwhile, there's a lot of really great stuff that happens because of a lot of people in this room. And it's I like to think of my own experience as a kind of slow awakening to what's going on. Partially, I'm from California, so I'm from the frontier, where we decided all you East Coast people did it wrong, so we're going to reinvent stuff on the coast. By the way, Californians totally screwed it up. Go to Seattle if you want to see where it's really interesting. Also problematic, but interesting, much more interesting. But so as a result, I grew up with a generation where we had Earth Day. And I, until a lunch conversation, had not realized, of course, it started in 1970. So to me, it's just like the thing you do in 7th grade. And when I went to college, of course you were going to take a class on the classics and feminist theory. Why wouldn't you take that? That was just a given. So to me, it was never really that intellectually or socially egregious to actually have an interest in this. In fact, I went to Reed College, which is known for a place where men wear skirts, women dress like men, where they in drag, so everybody's in drag. Sexual boundaries and identities are very, very fluid. Helps that we all study the Greeks. So it's a very interesting culture, because you take for granted the kinds of hierarchies, meanwhile, that not only had shifted into place, but that continued to shift into place in a variety of ways. And it was when I went to grad school, actually, it was kind of when it dawned on me that things were a little more rigid. And that's probably the time I started to watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer on television, which I actually credit with my move into a more intellectual feminism, because I actually wrote an article on Buffy while I was a grad student that in a lot of ways set up the fact that I'm standing here right now. Because that was the moment. I had done some work on gender and sexuality as a college student, but I hadn't really taken seriously this was the thing I wanted to do, because there were I was obsessed with poetics, and I was obsessed with culture in all sorts of different broad construals. And so, gender and sexuality actually was not necessarily the only cutting edge way you could do things. So it was in some way, I strangely took it for granted. The other thing I'd like to point out that's funny to me is activism. And thinking about activism. Because when I was in high school, I was actually voted most likely to lead a protest. Which is funny to me, because if there's an official category in which you can vote somebody most likely to lead a protest, it means it's sanctioned by the institution. And so I've secretly been living in all these paradoxes that I had never thought about as I moved through various stages of my life, because on the one hand, a lot of aspects of these things had been rendered quite clear by the 60s and 70s and 80s, but on the other hand, all these systems are moving in place to but maybe you shouldn't be watching the money, or maybe we'll look at the statistics but forget about the policy, or we'll talk about activism but we won't do activism. So when I went to college, for instance, I watched, I don't know if you know about the Barbie Liberation Organization, which was a prank that was pulled where a bunch of people around the US took Barbie and G.I. Joe talking dolls in 1993 and switched the voice chips. So Barbie said things like, "Dead men tell no tales." And Barbie said, or G.I. Joe said, "Let's go shopping." And the media footage, which I've illegally obtained, sort of is really sort of quite fascinating because it's like all the parents are freaking out and all the children are like, why can't they say that? What's the problem? And actually, one of the queer theory textbooks I teach with, actually, this is sort of their prime example of guerrilla activism, which is one of the things I quietly try to instill in our students. But I kind of, what's sort of been compelling for me as I've gotten older and as I've grown academically is moving from the West to the East after I finished graduate school in the Bay Area, which, as we all know, is a bastion of conservatism. I actually moved to Georgia for 3 years, where Reconstruction is still very much in the process. And it was actually, it's compelling because this is where the experiential became important for me, where it started to become necessary to say, I advocate feminism. And I sort of sided with Bell Hooks on this. I think I don't want to say I'm a feminist because I'm worried about the identity politics of it, but I want to say I advocate feminism. Because I don't want to sort of be trapped in that phenomena, because I think that might be, actually, is one of the reasons why it's good that we're moving from a women's studies to a women gender sexuality studies program. What was really interesting to me is living in Georgia was the first time I walked down the street and somebody felt compelled to call me a Jew or a fag. Just walking down the street, I'm just wearing Chuck Taylors. Now, I'm pretty sure they had never seen me sort of in any religious context. I'm pretty sure they hadn't been in the bedroom with me at any point in my life. So I don't know how they derive the evidence by which to make these claims, but these things were constantly lobbed at me. And it was really fascinating, from the West Coast, where granted all these problems are there, but the discourse about it is very different. And then to come to the East Coast. And then coming to Gettysburg was sort of another sobering moment because, of course, it's Pennsylvania, but it's Pennsyltucky, but it's north of the Mason-Dixon line, but apparently that doesn't mean the thing it seems to mean. And so it's a very complex series of interactions. And so I raise all this within the context of The Empire Strikes Back, because this moves us, of course, to the most unnecessarily complex of the three movies, The Return of the Jedi. And I say that because if you've ever watched the movie, you know that there are three things going on simultaneously. There's Lucas on the Death Star fighting with Darth Vader. Meanwhile, there's an attack against the Death Star by Lando Calrissian and Wedge, who is always ignored in all the movies. And then I have hilarious conspiracy theories about him. And then there's, of course, the people fighting with the stupid Ewoks on the planet of Endor. Those Ewoks are responsible for so much trouble in the world, and I'll spare you that, but that's part of the merchandising. So you have lots of complex things going on at once. And I think in a way that's sort of what's happened, is that things are getting further and further complicated. And not that they weren't before, but our ability to articulate it. I think one of the things I was really sort of struck by is it's not that these things haven't existed, and as a classic scholar, you look at the evidence, they've been there all the time. We know that. It's an issue of our ability to articulate it. And so one of the things that really we deal with is we're kind of counter-epistemology. We're a way of trying to say, how do we further refine the way we deal with this in a way then that we can promote social justice, in a way that we do really get equality for women, for lesbians, for gays, for bisexuals, for transsexuals, for transgender individuals, for intersexuals, right? Because we started to realize that every time you classify somebody, it comes at somebody else's expense. And that sort of gets us to a place of discomfort, that every time we make a decision, something bad could happen to somebody else. And the Greeks actually have a term for this, which is pathemathos, or suffering by, or learning by suffering, which comes from another trilogy, the Oresteia by Aeschylus. And so I've now come to this place where I realize, in a lot of ways, I view what our mission is to create a productive spiritual discomfort. And that is to say, to constantly ask ourselves, to constantly ask other members of the community, to ask ourselves as women and as men and as people who don't want to be identified as women or men but by other terminology, or not be identified at all, by people who just want to be people for whatever that term means, that we have to sort of create a real sense of how do we talk about ourselves respectfully, and then how do we move from there? And I sort of want to allude to something that really struck me. I don't have much experience at Gettysburg. I can't tell stories about what it means to be here, because I've only been here less than 2 years. But my time here has been defined by 2 moments so far. The first is by the changing the name of the program from Women's Studies to Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies, and sort of what are the implications of that? You know, do we, for instance, do we define women by whether or not they have babies? Or do we sort of, or what I think the more important question, what if a woman doesn't want to be defined by that capability at all? I mean, that's one of the sort of problems with the term. And so we're in this balancing act of like, how do we honor the history of women and at the same time allow people to sort of choose identities for themselves that they see. But the other thing I want to sort of mention, and I only do this because I think it's important, is we had a tragedy on this campus last spring where Emily Silverstein, a student, was killed in a case of intimate partner violence. And I was actually, if I'm not mistaken, the last professor to have a conversation with her. And it was actually, I was in the Peace House on campus having a conversation about homosexuality on campus, interestingly. It wasn't, and the conversation started out as about, is this a safe place to be gay? Is this a safe place to be a lesbian? Is this a safe place to be any sort of orientation other than heterosexual? And Emily, who was just this incredible spark of energy and just this very, very sharp mind, was like, had by the end of the conversation steered it to the point where it was clear that this was everybody's problem. Talking about homosexuality is about everybody, everybody's rights to express themselves, everybody's sense of safety and comfort, and the right to love and to express themselves. And for that, I'm forever grateful to her. And I think it's a cruel irony that she died in a case of intimate partner violence, which I think makes the point that all of these discussions are interrelated. And so I leave you with the thought that that's what I hope we can do as we move forward, is to always be vigilant and conscious about how we think about these things as really interrelated and interconnected, and how do we act in a way so as to sort of preserve each other's dignity for women, men, for everybody. Thank you.